And hello, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. Thank you for participating in 1455's second annual Summer Literary Festival. My name is Matt Davis, and I'm the founding director of the Alan Cheuse International Writers Center at George Mason University. And I've had the pleasure of working with 1455 and Sean Murphy on a couple of different events the past couple of years, and we were part of the inaugural festival last summer and are happy to be part of it again. And we're hopeful that next summer we'll be able to meet in person again in beautiful Winchester, Virginia. And with that in mind, these are really strange times. So let's all just sort of think about our first responders, people on the front lines of public health who are helping us through this crisis. But as for this festival, we hope that you will help us spread awareness by sharing your impressions of 1455 Summer Lit via social media, liking the 1455 Facebook page, and signing up for our newsletter. We also hope you'll dig deeper into the work of our authors. Their books are available for purchase via the links on the agenda page of the LitFest website. All purchases will be shipped directly to your door. And 1455 is delighted to be partnering with the Potter's House on book sales this year. They're a nonprofit bookstore, cafe, and event space in Washington, D.C. with a deep history of social justice and community building. You can learn more about their work at pottershousedc.org. And as a DC resident, they are really, really fantastic. So please do purchase these wonderful books that of our authors today, but the other authors on this year's calendar. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Robin and Justen. And a reminder, we hope to make these sessions as interactive as possible. So use the chat room to submit questions and we'll do our best to answer them, okay? So first I'm going to introduce Robin Hemley. Robin is the author of 14 books of fiction and nonfiction, most recently Borderline Citizen, Dispatches from the Outskirts of Nationhood, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about today, which the author Jeff Charlotte calls perhaps the most original travel book in years. His work has been published around the world and has won numerous awards, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation, 3 Pushcart Prizes in both fiction and nonfiction, the Independent Press Book Award for Nonfiction, and many others. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, he directed the nonfiction writing program at the University of Iowa for 9 years. He was recently named the inaugural director of the Polk School of Communications at Long Island University, as well as Parsons Family Chair in Creative Writing and University Professor. He is the founder and past president of the International Conference Nonfiction Now and co-editor of Speculative Nonfiction. And he was my teacher at Iowa. So I'm very, very pleased that Robin is joining us today. And we also have Justen Ahren. Is that right, Justen? I should have asked that before. Is that how you pronounce your last name? Ahren?
Correct, yes.
Justen is a poet, photographer, and musician. His recent book, A Machine for Remembering, is a collection of poems and photos from his time as a volunteer rescuing refugees arriving by boat to Lesvos, Greece. He is founder and former director of Noopi Center for the Literary Arts. He teaches writing workshops on devotion to writing. And for more information about Justen, please visit his website at justenahren.com and follow him on Instagram. Robin and Justen, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and welcome to the Literary Festival.
Thank you.
So this is obviously a unique way to conduct a panel virtually. And I think what we're gonna do is I'm gonna just ask some questions of both Robin and Justen as we move through their work and some larger ideas that sort of intersects with both of their works of literature and their ideas of nationhood and patriotism and borders and countries. And they're both really fascinating reads. So let's start with this. Let's sort of talk a little bit about the origins of these projects. And Robin, you talk about this in the opening section to your book. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you got to think about the issues that you raise in your book, Borderline Citizen, and so then how you actually went about visiting all these very different places across the globe that enabled you to write this book.
Yeah, well, back in the 1990s, I lived near an enclave or an exclave of the U.S. called Point Roberts, Washington, and it's a little town, a little hamlet off of a peninsula of Canada that by rights should belong to Canada, but doesn't, and it goes right below the 49th parallel. And I finally got around to visiting the place and was fascinated by their sense of citizenship and nationhood. They fly sort of hybrid flags that are half stars and stripes, half maple leaf. There, 75% of the homes are owned by Canadians, but it's a US town. And so I started getting in, and I wanted to go to, I started looking at some of these exclaves of different countries, and so many of them were these liminal and hybridized spaces of nationhood. And I always say I never had the patriot gene, is from a very early age. I was immersed in other cultures, and I valued my friendships with people around the world as much as I valued my friendships with Americans. So I started investigating patriotism and nationalism through the lens of enclaves and exclaves and overseas territories, which I visited on or around their national holidays, because I thought those would be a good time to really sort of have this heightened sense of nationalism or patriotism. So that's kind of in a nutshell.
Huh. And how did you, just as a quick follow-up, I mean, how did you identify these exclave and enclaves? Did you sort of research them and say, you know what, I really want to go here? I mean, like for the Falkland Islands, for example, I mean, how did you decide to travel there as opposed to other places?
Well, as I said, I decided to go to these places around their national holidays. England doesn't have an Independence Day because, you know, who are they going to declare independence from themselves? You know, but they have Guy Fawkes Day. So I was really interested in the Falklands, since I was alive during the Falkland War between Argentina and the UK, and I just, it was this very remote place, which is sort of known to be more British than England. They fly they fly Union Jacks in every window. There's a picture of Margaret Thatcher in every window. So I decided that seemed like a natural place to go. And then the other places were just really strange locales. I went to the border of Bangladesh and India, which had the most complicated border in the world. It had pockets of one another's international territory embedded in the other countries. So it had something like 200 or 300 enclaves of one another embedded in each country. And so I thought that would be a fascinating place to go. And then there were just these really unusual places where the borders were all kind of screwed up, messed up, and people had to live in these strange areas, like a place called Barley Hertog, Barley Nassau, which is on the border of Belgium and the Netherlands, where if you walk through town just on an evening stroll, you cross the border about 12 times. And international border goes right through someone's front door. The town hall is split in two by the international border. So places like that seem natural and places to investigate people's sense of identity. And
yeah, I loved all the pieces in the book. They were really fascinating to think about. And Justen, in terms of borders, I mean, you were working with people for which the idea of borders directly impacts their existence and their lives. Many refugees coming from all over the globe through to Europe. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about your experiences and how that sort of inspired you to write your collection of poetry.
Sure. So I actually didn't start out to write, I didn't set out to write a book about that experience. I had been working for a couple of years already on poems around the theme of exile, which I find, to be this fairly, I would say, universal human experience in one way or another. I think humans experience exile from our pasts. We have memory to kind of access the past, but we can't really get back to the past otherwise. All the loved ones in our lives that have died, and we can't be with them again. There's that sort of exile. The exile that we experience from, what's the divine? Why are we here? What is being? This kind of, bridging this kind of greater meaning between ourselves and something greater than us. So I was writing a lot, maybe for 2 years, about maybe a little longer, on just on that theme. And then This was 2015, 2016. And this is when the European refugee crisis really started to really, I don't know what word to use, but it's when it was the kind of the height of it, especially with the Syrian civil war erupting. And so these images and stories and things that were coming across my news feed every day, I began to think about how I was responding to these images that I was getting, and the stories I was reading, and they really are affecting me emotionally. And so it kind of worked into what I was already exploring with this theme of exile and even my own feelings of exile. And I worked on this for another year, now really focused on writing poems about, what was happening with the refugee crisis in Europe. But that ultimately was leaving me to this kind of dead end. I was doubting whether the book was working. I was anxious that, I really didn't have any authenticity. I had no way to really speak about what was going on, just kind of from my safe little bubble of distance. I was traveling with my son. I think we were in Spain, and I was telling him, he was 15 at the time, I was talking with him about my insecurities about this project, and I felt like I was just going to maybe abandon it, but I hated to abandon something that I'd been working on for so long. And he said, well, Dad, why don't you go do something to help the people you're writing about? And that was kind of this little push that I needed to take a bigger step. And that's when I started to do some research on organizations that were offering volunteer positions or working with refugees directly in different countries. And ultimately I went with a organization out of Norway called A Drop in the Ocean. And I chose them for the main reason was at night they patrolled the beaches from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, and they actively engaged in rescuing people who were coming ashore. And so that felt like something I could make a big difference in people's lives to do work like that. But then the other part of what they did was during the day, they ran a soup kitchen, and they allowed a community center and a soup kitchen, and they allowed people to come in, and you would serve them food, and you could sit and, have a meal with people and talk with them. And that felt like another really practical way to kind of connect with people. And that's really where I started to hear the stories that I began to weave into the poems. That for me it's really what brought the poetry alive, the poems themselves alive, and ultimately formed the real fabric, I think, of this book.
That's great. That's really, really fascinating and interesting. And I feel like we could talk about that for, I'm very curious. I lived in Syria for a spell right before, on the brink of the civil war. And so I have a very strong connection to the refugee crisis from Syria in particular. But you did mention memory and exile, Justen, and I think memory in terms of nationhood is something that our country is really dealing with and struggling with and investigating and interrogating right now in some very significant ways. And Robin, in your book, memory comes up quite a bit in terms of how people remember what the idea of nation is, or how sort of trickles down to these places that are not connected with the mainland. Again, the Falkland Islands comes to mind right away. But what did you learn about this idea of national memory in all of these writings and sort of travels that you did? And how has that shaped your thinking in this contemporary moment in the United States, if at all?
Well, early on in my travels, I went to a little island off of the coast of Nova Scotia called Saint-Pierre, and it's Saint-Pierre and Miquelon are the last overseas territories of France in North America. And I went there for Bastille Day. I didn't write about it in the book so much, but I did meet someone there, a writer who was Acadian from Acadie, which is a country that exists and doesn't exist. Her name is Françoise Angard. And she said that she told me about this French philosopher who named Ernest Renan, who in 1881 delivered a talk to the Sorbonne entitled "What is a Nation?" And he and it sounds like a simple question, but at the time and even now, it's a very complex question. because nations as we know them are relatively recent. If you look at a map of even just 100 years ago, the nations are, so many nations are different. And certainly in 1881, Germany was new, Italy was new, Australia hadn't even become a nation. You know, they're all and India was a collection of 600 princely states. And Ernest Renan said that memory was really important to nationhood, that people not only remembered their victories, but their defeats, that the notion of defeat, a kind of shared suffering, was really, really important to national identity. And if you think about it in US history and American history, that's true. Certainly the kind of remember the Alamo kind of spirit, you know, so notion, and also another thing besides that, that struck me was that he said that though nations are new, they appeal to antiquity all the time. They try to give the sense of having been around or connected to some kind of golden past, you know, to sort of keep the people, the idea of the nation together. And Mussolini did that in before World War II with Italy. You know, there were a bunch of, for instance, there were a bunch of old Renaissance buildings surrounding the Colosseum. He just had them all torn down so that you could have this grand view of the Colosseum. And he made a very conscious effort to connect his fascist regime to the Roman Empire, you know, as this direct connection of greatness. So nations and national leaders are always appealing to greatness, whether it's greatness through shared victory or greatness in even shared defeat. And briefly about Akkadian, the Akkadian nation, what struck me about that is it was one of the first examples in sort of recent history anyway, of ethnic cleansing, where the British came in and forced a lot of the French out of Canada, brought a bunch of them to Louisiana. They became the Cajuns, and exiled a lot of others. And the Acadians lost their land. But what's remarkable is that they still have a national identity. They have a Congress every year. They have a flag. They have a national anthem. And Francois Angard told me they have all the trappings of nationhood, but no territory. And she said, in a way, that's really freeing, because we have the memory of being a people, but we don't have all the, you know, crap surrounding territory.
Right, right. Yeah, that's really interesting. I really enjoyed reading about that in your book. And Justen, what was your experience when you were speaking with many of these refugees that were coming into Europe about their memories, their ideas of their homelands that they were fleeing from, and how that sort of impacted their identities right now? I mean, that word refugee is so loaded with all kinds of terminology and thoughts, that I wonder what you sort of learned from your time with these men, women, and children.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating that, you know, what individuals want to personally remember, what they want to kind of archive. And in talking to individuals, I met one young poet, 23-year-old woman from Syria. Her name was Alma. I met her at the refugee camp in Lesbos, and she had made a choice that she wasn't going to write about the violence and the bad things that had happened to her. And she told me this. She said, I can't write about what I'm seeing in this camp and the squalor and the violence and the, you know, if I wrote about that, it just would further kill me. So she said, I'm only writing love poems, and I'm writing love poems to my country, about my city, about the street that I grew up on. And that was her way of, I think, surviving what she's been through, the trauma that she's been to, but also, you know, making a conscious decision that she's going to remember certain things in certain ways. And also I met another young man, a 15-year-old boy, as old as my son was at the time, who had walked most of the way from Afghanistan in order to get a bus in order to actually get a bus through Iran and then hire smugglers to drive him and two other boys his age through Turkey, where they got on boats, these little rafts, and came across. But he was living in the camp as well. And he shared a lot of his personal stories with me. And, you know, his only connection then to his family, who he was on his way to Europe in order to make money to send back to his family because they were so poor. He told me he had to stand on a chair in his yard and eat all the leaves from the trees. That's where he, you know, that's what they had to do in order to eat at some point. And so, you know, the stories he shared with me were a way of kind of keeping alive his family and where he was from and the journey he had made. And he wasn't avoiding necessarily the traumatic things, but it became apparent to me that, and writing this book, that the memories, these memories were, it was important for me to put it in the book, because the book, the title of the book, A Machine for Remembering, that reflects poetry and writing in general is a machine for remembering, but also that these individual stories are an archive of individuals' memories and the things that they had that they've gone through.
And so much of what struck me about reading the book, Justen, was I mean, you mentioned this earlier, is this idea of responsibility. There's oftentimes, there's poems where you're juxtaposing, you know, a very sort of two very different kinds of existences, whether, you know, if you're writing poetry about, you know, making love versus the violence that's taking place in a different part of the world. I mean, talk a little bit about that, about your idea of witness and your idea of responsibility to what you were seeing, and how you wanted that reflected in your poetry.
Sure. So I'm glad you picked up on that. I'm really happy you picked up and are pointing that out. That was really one of the driving things for me in writing these poems, was how close could I put intimate, personal, private moments and experiences, like making love, or, you know, making a piece of toast for your wife. How close could I put these moments next to violence, an explosion on the street, bodies hanging from lampposts? And the reason that was important to me was, you know, in our modern world, you know, we get images and we get tweets and we get these news feeds, and it's whatever happens in the world is instantaneous. It comes to us instantaneous, and it intrudes upon whatever intimate moment we have. So we could be having dinner, we could be, you know, making love and scrolling through our news feed, and we're interrupted all the time by this kind of savagery of the world. And yet I find this, you know, one of the hopeful things is that somehow we as human beings continue to find beauty amidst all of this too. And so I guess I kind of personally wanted to keep finding beauty amidst the savagery and amidst the violence that I was writing about. But I also got that from the people that I was meeting and talking with, that they continued to find beauty somehow, that they continue to really fall back on. I remember Alma, the young poet, Syrian poet I was just talking about, you know, her father was left behind in Syria, and she said, I can still smell him, you know, I can still smell him. And so, you know, that intimacy, that personal is never going to leave, doesn't leave her. The other thing I wanted to mention about all of this is I'm really skeptical of national memory in a sense, especially mass culture, the way that we derive memory, like 9/11, for example. Unless you were unfortunate enough to actually be there and witness the planes hitting the buildings, we've all seen that same image of the planes hitting the buildings from the exact same angle. And this has become this kind of collective memory that we've made personal, internalized, but it's actually the exact same image for nearly everyone. And so that's why I'm skeptical of it, because I think it's a little bit devoid of something personal in some way. I think in some way it obliterates the individual as mass culture, you know, can. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. Robin, did you want to say something about that? I saw you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, as I said, I'm very skeptical of I mean, I've been thinking about nationalism and patriotism and all of that for quite a long time, and those sort of appeals to national memory, victories, defeats, and 9/11 is a perfect example, are often used very cynically and callously by political leaders. I also want to say that in my book, I met a young man from Afghanistan who was a refugee from the Hazara community. His father had been, who was a doctor, had been killed. His brother had been killed by the Taliban. And he was there in a very contingent space. He wanted to meet with me. He wanted his story to be heard. He could be deported at any time. And I happened to be there with my daughter, who turned out to have been born about 12 days before him. And it was a cause for me to really think about the differences in these two young lives and what they, and at one point I asked him, you know, what do you think about your country? What do you think about Afghanistan? And he said, it's my country. I love it. And I said, but, you know, it's a country that, you know, I didn't say in exactly these words, but that wants you dead, you know? And he said, and then he backed up and said, well, it's where my family is. It's where my memories are. And I love my family. And that's what it is, you know? And if I didn't, but I have not one happy memory of that place. I have not one day where I can say, this was a beautiful day. I would never go back there if not for my family.
I think that's really, I love that piece in the book. And I also think it brings up something that I have found, I think this passage is actually from this piece that you're referring to, Robin, because this contrast of people and places, right? These ideas of like countries versus people that are in them. And one of the sections of your book, you're right, isn't it strange, you think, and the you in this case is you thinking on the page, that our first reaction is to say we love our countries, and what we love is much less abstract than a nation. You love, for instance, the person sitting beside you. You will always be loyal to her. People do not have their own flags, their own colors, their national bird or national flower. They do not have anthems or pledges. Their borders are as physical as their bodies and as lasting as their mortal lives. Our loyalty to the people we love is so much simpler. At the same time, it is so much more complex than our love for our nations. And I just thought that was a really interesting and just spot on point. And I, you know, one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading that was, you know, would it be interesting if instead of saying, you know, tomorrow I'm flying to Japan, or tomorrow I'm, you know, gonna drive to Canada, for like, you know, tomorrow I'm going to fly and go see some Japanese, or go see my friends that are there, and sort of emphasize the idea that people are what make a nation, not so much a nation itself. And I thought that piece from the Afghan section of your book, Robin, was really, really, really spot on.
Thank you. Well, I mean, one thing that was said to me early on, and that I've told my children about institutions, that we can be loyal to an institution, but institutions are rarely loyal to the individual. And I'm someone who I fully believe in community, in a sense of a kind of interdependence between people. But I think that that's where the emphasis has to be put, not on abstract nations.
Yeah, yeah. So we are about halfway through this discussion. I just want to remind folks who are listening that if they want to ask any questions of something that you've heard of Robin, of Justen, of these ideas that we've been discussing, you can use the Q&A section on your computer or on your phone, depending what you're watching on, listening on, and ask us a question. And I certainly have a lot more to get to, but we'd love to hear from you as well. And, you know, I think one of the things that struck me both about both your work was this idea of survivors. And Robin, you, in your book, you directly sort of have an essay that discusses this in two seemingly kind of different places, but very similar sorts of ethoses, if you will. And I wonder if you can sort of, without giving away the entire essay, talk a little bit about what the contrast was there between those two sections, and how that impacted your thinking of borders and nations.
So my wife's from the Philippines, and I've written about the Philippines and spent a lot of time there. And so I happened to be in the Philippines for a documentary that was that was done by a friend of mine about the end of World War II, and a little known event where 100,000 civilians were massacred in a month by Japanese occupying forces in Manila. And it was a very gruesome documentary, and I was surrounded by survivors of this massacre. And then I happened to be going relatively shortly afterwards to Berlin, and for an art opening, and so I was in these two cities that had been decimated and had decimated other countries during World War II, and just thinking a lot about being in places where I would not have survived. For instance, as a Jew, and my aunt Rose was a survivor of Auschwitz, and it just got me to thinking again about the ways in which people move through history, or should I say history moves through them, and how the difference of, say, 50 or 75 years in where you live being a place that will either kill you or allow you to survive is kind of remarkable. When I was an exchange student in Japan, in the 1970s in Osaka, Japan, I was keenly aware that had I been there during World War II, I would have been imprisoned or killed or whatever. And so I've always thought about this notion that that where I am in time and place contributes so much to whether I can survive or not, and not just me but everyone. So that essay was about just kind of a reflection on how people survive and how place affects that.
Well, I was also, it was interesting that the personalities of the survivors were very very sharp and very sort of, very hearty. And one in particular was, very willing to go to the dark places to joke about this stuff in ways that I think for non-survivors just would be unthinkable.
Yeah. There was an elderly woman who had survived, terrible atrocities, and I found that a lot of the survivors that I met were actually, and this is not the case universally, but had really gallows sense of humor. She was with this, we were sitting at a table, and there was this woman who, the survivor asked this woman who was somewhat younger than her, what brought you, she was a white American woman, what brought you to the Philippines? And the woman said, well, my husband was from the Philippines, and we decided to move back to the Philippines. But shortly after we arrived, he died. And the older woman, Jessie, I believe was her name, said, well, at least you didn't have to pay to have the body shipped back, which completely shocked the woman whose husband had died. And then the woman just said, look, you don't get to be my age if you don't have a sense of humor. So I just, of course, I wasn't going to forget that. And that had to be an essay.
Yeah. And Justen, you have already talked a little bit about what the experiences of some of the people that you met in Greece in terms of their sense of surviving what they experienced. But more directly into your work, into your writing, or into the stories that you heard and met. I mean, how did that idea of survivorship, which is kind of a little bit embedded in the idea of a refugee in terms of you're leaving someplace that you can no longer be. How did that sort of impact your thinking of your own poetry, but also just as a traveler and as a human?
Well, first thing I would say is this, the people that I met seemed to me to carry a kind of unique sense of guilt and responsibility. And that varied depending on the individual. So, for example, I mentioned the 15-year-old Afghani boy, Hussein, who I spent an afternoon with. His sense of responsibility was that out of all of his siblings, he was the one that was sent. And he needs, for him, it was imperative to get to Europe and to make money. So there was really no turning back. And once he did get to Europe, he knew that he needed to make the money in order to repay, his family for all the trouble that they had gone through to, to be able to even give him the money that he needed to get as far as he had gotten. And so that sort of responsibility. And for those who survive, say, they've left behind family who have died, as a lot of the Syrians, like Alma, again, to talk about her, her father had remained in the country. And so the sense of guilt, perhaps, I mean, he was still alive. He had survived to that point when I met her. But, she had this, there was a definite burden upon her that, she had gotten out and he was still there. And so I think there's a sense with survivors of how they're going to curate their family history, their memories, what they're going to do with their lives to make it justified. And then one final person was Maya, another Syrian woman, 43-year-old woman, mother of 4 kids already, who was pregnant and living in the camp. And she had gotten pregnant because she was raped by one of the guards at the camp. And so she had his child. And she said, if I had known it was going to be this, terrible, I would never have made this journey. I would have rather have stayed in Syria and taken my chances. And so I think that's also, another thing that survivors have to deal with, is this further trauma on top of the trauma that they've already had to endure from making a journey like this, and then getting to a place where they're not being welcomed. So they're early on in the process, I think if you had come early from Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq, say 2015 or 2016, you may have been able to make it to Germany or England or France or, wherever most of the people wanted to get to. And then once they started closing the borders down, people have been trapped in these camps in Turkey and in Greece. And it really isn't what they, set out, where they set out to be, and they're stuck in this liminal space, and the campus is horrible, and so there's really it's an in-between life. It's a stateless life. There's no way to go forward and kind of rebuild a life, because you're constantly just waiting to be either sent forward or sent back.
Justin, your book is primarily poetry, but it also has some really beautiful photography, and then you've also composed musical pieces to what you learned and to some of the actual language of the poems themselves. Yeah. So what made you want to engage with this material and these ideas in these different kinds of ways?
Sure. Thanks for asking that. So I will, if people are interested in the album, they can go to, it is available on Spotify and Pandora and Apple Music. It's called The War for the Valley. But what inspired the music, first of all, I inherited a piano during this time, and it was between my kitchen and my den where I write, and I had to pass it many times a day. And so I would sit down and start, teaching myself to play the piano. I did not realize that I had this music kind of coming that was directly related to the poetry I was writing. It was just a different way I was needing to kind of find that expression. It was almost like, being able to cry through this instrument about the, things I was working on writing about and having to process. The photographs, again, the photographs, I picked up a camera because To me, these poems, the entire book is black and white. Everything looks black and white to me. When I saw these poems in my head, the landscape was black and white. It was stark. And I feel like I just needed a way to make that visual for myself. And so I began to take these photographs. Even before I went to Syria to volunteer, I had been traveling to Italy and different places and was photographing some of the some routes that refugees were taking, or, you know, encampments by the train tracks or encampments down by the river outside of Rome, under bridges. All of these were done in black and white. I just think for me, it was a way, the photographs were just a way to make visual what I was feeling and seeing inside about these poems, that this was just a black and white world. And I needed to kind of give a way to, I needed to put that into a form in order to get it out of myself.
Hmm. And Robin, your work is, in this book at least, is you have written all kinds of different types of literature, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, poetry. But here you're dealing a lot with travel narrative, with essay, research, and I'm wondering what sort of models you were looking at when you were writing this. Was there some sort of books or authors that you had in mind that you were looking as if this is the kind of book that I want to write, or was this, because in some ways this is, you know, I've not really seen a book about these different exclave and enclaves and the sort of the complications that arise out of these ideas of borders and nationhood, you know, talked
Yeah.
about in this way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I had my original concept for the book was quite different. It took a long time for it to gel. I was against writing essays at first. I wanted it to be to have some kind of narrative arc and some kind of glue other than the concept. But I enlarged the idea of the book, and not all of the essays in the book are about enclaves and exclaves exactly, but they are, as Justen's book in some ways, also about exile too. And so I enlarged that concept, but I thought of certain books of place that I see as models, but I can't see a direct connection to my book. Like I've always loved the writer Jan Morris's book Trieste, which is this sort of love song biography to the Italian port of Trieste that used to be a central port of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then became a kind of backwater in Italy. And Jan Morris saw this place as this sort of liminal place of identity, exploring her identity as well. And so that kind of gave me the kind of ethos, I'd say, for the book, using place as metaphor, though she really, the book is only about Trieste and tangentially about her and her transition from a man to a woman. And so she had come in to Trieste first in 1945 as a soldier marching in, and then had all these memories of it, and really saw it as something that was very closely but complexly linked to her identity. So for me, that was something that I wanted to explore.
How do you both think the pandemic that we're currently experiencing is going to be shaping borders and ideas of country and nation? I think in one sense you have a virus that knows no borders and no bounds, but you certainly have nations that are responding in very different ways, both to curb the outbreaks, but also to prevent people from coming in. I mean, the Trump administration obviously has used this to significantly curtail immigration. I mean, how do you see this sort of impacting people's lives beyond the immediacy of what we're experiencing right now? Either of you can take that on first.
Well, I guess I don't know if I'm shocked at how quickly we retreated to our borders, to our kind of own corners. Everybody go to your own country or whatever country you can belong to, and kind of lock down. I feel like that's the immediate implications of that is it's strengthened or reinforced kind of this mentality of nation states, which is, there has to be, in order for there to be an us, there has to be an other. And so, immediately it's, as you have mentioned, Trump administration taking the opportunity to kind of, do things with, be more stringent with immigration on our own borders. And I feel like other countries are doing the same thing. What I find ironic about it has been turned around on the United States is we kind of continue to go out of control here with the pandemic. These other countries are saying we can no longer come to their country because of the threat we pose to their health, which is, as I mentioned, it's ironic. I don't know. I like to hope and think that there's something positive that will come out of this kind of, a more shared and community in which we kind of help one another through, as you mentioned, the virus knows no borders. And so even though the response so far hasn't been that coordinated globally, I'd like to think that something like this would maybe unify the response so that, we take care of one another completely and holistically, as opposed to just kind of retreating to our lowest common denominators.
Yeah, for me, it shows kind of the failures of nationalism, that the response to something like this should be a unified global one. And instead, each country is saying, I'm going to get the vaccine first and I won't share it, and that is just a really wrong-headed approach to something that affects everyone that crosses borders. I'm reminded, and it's really disheartening the way many Americans have reacted to this. I remember when I was about in 5th grade, there was this kid who would always bully me, and he'd say, if I'd say, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this to me? And he would say, it's a free country. And that to me is very emblematic of the way that people are reacting to the virus. It's like, if the fact that I have to wear a mask or that I might affect you means nothing to me because it's a free country. And so of course we're all getting sick. And so every aspect of this, I think, shows the failures of nationalism.
What about, Robin, I know you in particular are an avid traveler. I mean, it's hard to sort of keep up with you at times where you're always in different places. I mean, how is this impacted, you personally? Do you miss traveling? Do you miss sort of the ability to sort of get on a plane and go somewhere? Or has it been sort of like a little bit of a pause period for you?
So my Google Calendar still thinks I'm traveling, because every once in a while I get a message saying that I'm supposed to catch a plane from Edinburgh somewhere, or Thailand, and I just kind of ignore it. I laugh at it because for me, being in place has been fine. I probably personally needed to settle a bit. I'm sad that it took a pandemic to do this, but no, I don't miss. I do miss traveling a bit, but I think I'll get back to it. And I think that what's happened to me is it's made me think a lot, be very reflective again about my traveling and about my place and where I am. And I'm in a city, a town I love, and with my family, so I'm okay for the time being.
Great. And Justen, what about you? Are you? I don't know if you frequently travel as very often or not, or I mean, but certainly, I mean, you're in Martha's Vineyard right now, which is an epicenter for travel both internationally and nationally. I mean, how has this impacted your own sort of perspective on travel?
Great. I'll answer that in 1 second, but I'm interested in Robin. Do you travel just for fun, or are you you travel a lot for work?
Traveling largely for work, but also for fun. I would say that, I mean, a lot of the travel I've done has been around this book, you know,
Yes.
and then I do a lot of workshops around the world. And I I was living in Singapore for 5.5 years, teaching there at a liberal arts college called Yale NUS. And so I was able to travel around Southeast Asia quite easily. Yeah.
I'm definitely a nomad, Matthew. And the way that it's affected me, it hasn't been so apparent yet. But my schedule in the fall and the winter is I teach in Italy in the fall and I teach in Mexico in the winter. And so that's to be determined. I mean, the fall is already canceled, so that is out. So that affects me from a work standpoint. More just from my nomadic spirit standpoint, it hasn't really, I haven't gotten to the point where I'm itching at this moment. And I live in a beautiful place. So it's really, I can always just take a walk out my back door and I kind of fill up with the beauty. But I love other cultures. So I especially miss, I love Mexico. I go there, I've gone there every year, probably for the past 15 or 20 years. And so I know that if it comes to that and I won't be able to go, that I'd be missing that infusion of life that just really fills me up. But the interesting thing about this pandemic for me personally was I was traveling when it hit. I was in France, living in France. And so that was a unique experience, which has already informed the next project that I'm working on. But what it did for me was make me more present to my surroundings than I had ever been, than I ever remember being. And a lot of my poems are generated from memory, regardless of the project. But this one has been so grounded in the present moment and writing in the present tense, that's been, from an artistic standpoint, it's been really enriching. So
that's interesting. Yeah. Has this impacted your writing at all, Robin?
Well, I just finished a bunch of projects, so I've taken it as I hit the pause button, and I've taken it as an opportunity to just think a little while before I jump into another project. So, I've been taking notes on a new novel, but I'd say that right now I'm sort of in a gathering state as far as my writing goes, which is fine. I feel like I'm in a spot right now where I need to just, be reflective. I did something a little unusual for someone who's a bit older. I decided several years ago to get a PhD, and I got a PhD in Australia. So I was going to Australia quite a lot. And I just recently got awarded my PhD, and I had never walked in a graduation ceremony before. And I thought, this time I'm going to walk. I'm going to just do it. And then the pandemic hit. And so, yeah, I don't know if that's ever going to happen.
Not to be. That's funny. Well, if there are no questions from the audience, we have about a couple minutes left. And I guess the one last thing is I would just love to get both of your takeaways from writing these books, in terms of not your message, but something that you learned that you didn't include in the book, or something that you sort of took and sort of has impacted and affected how you view this idea of nation, whether it's our own, the United States, or something else. What's sort of not in the pages that has impacted you?
I think for me, it's just sort of solidified notions I've had before about the interconnectedness of people rather than nations. And, again, this sort of notion of institutions versus people. I found that there were a lot of places that I visited that I didn't write about. And it was the places that felt most either disconnected to their motherland, let's say, or those places that felt most connected that really made the biggest impact on me. I'd say that for me, the sort of last chapter of this book has been this sort of sitting in one place in Iowa City in the middle of the US and, going mushroom hunting and things like that, and how connected I am to my family.
Yeah, it is ironic. I remember, Robin, this book launched right when the pandemic was hitting. So
the day the CDC declared a pandemic was my publication.
Thank you, CDC. So I mean, it certainly has changed what you, I'm sure, envisioned this launch to be like. Yeah. And Justen, what about you? What was one of the takeaways that you had that's not on the pages or in your music or photography?
Yeah, well, I would say that I've probably known this, and it's one of the reasons I love to travel, is that it reminds me continuously, travel does, that we're similar, regardless of where we're from in the world, or our conditions. We're at heart, we're similar in our what we want privately, what we want, what our own private thoughts are, what we hold in our heart. It's all, we want security, we want opportunity, we want we want a better life for those that we love, and that these divisions that we think that there are really just fabrications. They're constructs that are, we may buy into or believe when we kind of start to, build up that I belong to this group or this state or this nation. But, whenever you meet people individually, if you just don't, when you don't talk about that stuff and you just talk person to person, and it's exactly the same. Everybody, we have the same concerns and fears and anxieties, and we all want the same things. We don't want to leave home. We want what's, we just want something better, and that's what we're really all working for. I find people to be tremendously generous and open-hearted and good-natured, and I think that's one of the real benefits of traveling, is that reminds you and shows you and proves that to you over and over again.
And it also puts your own nation in perspective too. That's one thing that I find travel does that I love, is just that it heightens it puts your own nation and your relation to it in high relief, in ways that I find really intriguing.
Well put by both of you. Thank you both, Robin and Justen, for joining us today, and for all of you that were listening on this conversation, thank you for joining us. A couple quick reminders that all the programming for the 1455 Literary Arts Festival is free, so attend any and all panels that you would like. And all these panels are recorded, and each session will be on the 1455 website. We will be sending out e-surveys after the event. We'll welcome your feedback. And finally, we've endeavored to make this entire event free to everyone. It's not free to produce. So if you like what you experienced and want to help subsidize this and future events, please consider a tax-deductible donation via 1455litarts.org. Every penny helps. And with that in mind as well, please go and purchase Robin and Justen's book. They're really wonderful reads. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Thank you again, Robin and Justen. And
thank you, Matt.
Be well and healthy.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Enjoyed it very much.